I'm Jacob Hackett from the College of Education and Human Development here at Georgia State, Middle and Secondary Department, and specifically Curriculum and Instruction and Teacher Preparation. Why do we need multiple disciplines to address this wicked problem of housing? When asked about a problem related to housing, one may initially consider issues of inequitable access, gentrification, or perhaps sustainable building practices. And although these issues are important, the discipline of education gives us a unique way to examine housing. There's actually quite a strong relationship between schooling, school funding, real estate development, and a massive movement to privatize public education. So by looking at housing's impact on schools and schools' impact on housing, a tightly interconnected and complex story begins to emerge. For example, education research and policy has traditionally focused on something that almost everyone has heard of, the achievement gap, which is essentially the difference in standardized test scores between racial groups of children. Over the last 40 years, nearly every facet of education became fixated on closing these gaps. But the housing industry was also fixated on these gaps. Real estate companies began to use these test scores to create a highly contested but widely normalized grading system for schools. Quite a savvy marketing ploy. But we can thank education researchers such as Gloria Ladson-Billings for challenging our obsession with the achievement gap, which often led to children being blamed for their own low academic achievement. Dr. Ladson-Billings demands that we actually consider the education debt that poor students and students of color have been saddled with across generations. How schools have been suffocated through inequitable funding streams, such as property values, neoliberal reform efforts, and a hyper-standardized curricula. She demands that we use insights from sociology, history, ethnic studies, urban planning, and anthropology to be considered when preparing teachers, administrators, and policymakers. So these future leaders see the through line between redlining and school segregation to an equitable school funding and current patterns of gentrification that shape their school populations. A specific project related to this wicked problem is called the Ecological Equity Audit. These are research portfolios that our students compile by critically examining their student teaching placement. Audits analyze the socio-historical, economic, racial, and political conditions impacting their schools and their students' development. By including audits in teacher preparation, we're attempting to shift away from a traditional emphasis in teacher preparation on just students' instructional skills and towards their contexts and environments. The audit supports our equity-oriented teachers to deepen their critical consciousness and awareness of often oppressive social conditions impacting their students. We analyze what Guerrero and Pena originally called the hidden curriculum. This is the unstated norms, values, and beliefs that are transmitted to students through the underlying structure of meaning in both formal content as well as the social relations of their school, classroom, and community life. Audits contain methodical prompts to help educators uncover specific elements of the hidden curriculum in their schools, including oppressive school, classroom, housing, and community conditions. But this project also helps educators see how to counter these conditions. For example, audits reveal possible points of resistance to economic and racial stratification by compelling our students to create community asset maps. These maps show a very wide range of community institutions, outreach centers, community members, and community leaders who our teachers could partner with to enhance their standardized curricula by what we call contextualizing their content to the lived experiences of their students. Audits from previous years were shared with GSU's College of Law professor Tanya Washington's Year 2 law students who then took our findings to craft legal and policy briefs for local school districts. I'll mention 3 Metro Atlanta examples connected to housing and education, and I'll elaborate on the third. The first is tax allocation districts, or TADs. TADs are relatively unique because they're economic and real estate development triads between the City of Atlanta, Atlanta Public Schools, and the Fulton County Commissioner. Unfortunately, TADs have a problematic history of misappropriating funds, and by 2041, APS will have contributed $1.6 billion in tax revenue for redevelopment rather than educational purposes. The second is the demolition of public housing complexes in our city, increasing student displacement. And the third is the fast-growing privatization of education movement, including things like the rise in charter and partner schools, and Atlanta Public Schools' outsourcing of school curricular and discipline management to corporate-backed charter management organizations, which frequently operate under and or alongside real estate development corporations. Charter schools began quite altruistically. Their first advocates said they'd create, research, and share innovative curriculum in independent schools for children facing housing insecurity in Minneapolis in the early 1990s. But those hopes dashed as the movement has been co-opted by profitable, large-scale charter networks and education management organizations. Some with financial portfolios spanning well beyond schools and into commercial and residential real estate development. Our educators must be aware of the privatization movement nationally and locally due to the targeting of our most vulnerable communities, which are predominantly Black here in Atlanta. In fact, the NAACP has endorsed a moratorium on charter expansion due to their deeply problematic impact on vulnerable communities and children. Locally, purpose-built schools and purpose-built communities and the KIPP Charter School Network are some examples of both charter school expansion and charter housing partnerships occurring in areas where intergenerational school disenfranchisement is most extreme, including the south and west areas of Atlanta and Fulton County, areas where many of our student teaching internships take place. Atlanta built the nation's first public housing in the 1930s, and by the 2010s had torn them all down. In their wake, public schools they left behind have been dramatically reconfigured. A year ago, Atlanta Public Schools had a student population that's 72% Black, 16% white, 8% Hispanic, 3% multiracial, but also has specific schools within its boundaries that are 91 and 93% white, and others that are 99% Black, making it one of the most segregated school districts in the country. The district is currently under federal investigation by the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education concerning allegations of discrimination based on race, and whether Atlanta Public Schools subjected students at one school to different treatment based on race. Our students are being asked to develop their teaching skills in environments that are deeply impacted by decades of neoliberal school reform initiatives, and which Nolowi Rooks provocatively calls the segronomics of education. This exposes the very big business that profits from creating separate and unequal schools that fail to provide a high-quality education to all children. Though these policies are beyond the control of our students and teachers in general, it's imperative that our educators research their context so that they can become masterful at noticing when administrators and policymakers are part of the privatization movement that often requires standardized and decontextualized curriculum control measures. Research shows that educators not prepared with an ecological or multidisciplinary perspective often ignore these structures when analyzing and discussing their schools and students. These deficit-oriented discussions can solely focus on achievement gaps and center on a lack of student academic performance or parental involvement, while ignoring or dismissing generations of community and school reform policies like zero tolerance and an overemphasis on culturally irrelevant curricula. Our students and surrounding communities must be aware of the well-funded, coordinated, and ongoing efforts by corporations, including real estate development corporations, to alter how America's children are educated in the management of our public school system, particularly reallocating public dollars earmarked for public education into the private sector. For example, Georgia enacted a private school tax credit scholarship program that diverts $100 million annually to private schools. In addition, provisions to grow charter schools at the local and state level. Recently, though, the privatization movement is being exposed. Renewed oversight efforts and critical education research is mounting. Ironically, data strongly suggests that counter to glossy marketing campaigns, charter and partner schools operated by outsourced education management organizations actually don't outperform traditional public neighborhood schools. This can support our students, the university, and surrounding communities with an opportunity to develop a more critical eye towards these reform agendas, especially since 29% of APS students now attend a charter or partner school. This information allows for the public dialogue to shift from solely focusing on student achievement to include broader collateral damage caused by charter schools and private education management organizations. Collateral damage such as increased racial and disability segregation in districts, severe discrepancies in special education services offered between charter and traditional schools, the increased displacement of low-income families as housing developers miss low-income occupancy targets, even when they tout mixed-income housing development projects, and traditional public school closures or mergers, which are then turned into charter schools. Luckily, several homegrown grassroots advocacy and community-based organizations exist to research, monitor, and expose charter school networks and privatized education management organizations in our area. These include Public Education Matters Georgia, Project South, and Southerners on New Ground, just to name a few. Our discipline of teacher education is ever reliant on the connection and collaboration with other disciplines. As an applied discipline, we're at the convergence of traditional sciences such as chemistry, biology, and geometry, along with development in cognitive psychology, to understand content, curricular design appropriate for child and adolescent learning. But new, more progressive connections are emerging between teacher education and Africana studies, sociology, gender and equity studies, urban planning, social work, and political science. These connections may provide paradigm-shifting possibilities in the ways that we prepare and support educators. Two recent examples of teacher education research collaboratives we've designed and studied include Ascend, or the Atlanta Schools Critical Education Network for Distinction, and the BHC, or Ella Baker, Eugenia Hope, Septima Clark Institute. First, Ascend is an ongoing interdisciplinary coalition supporting the critical consciousness of social justice educators. Ascend partners include activist faculty from GSU's middle and secondary education and Africana Studies departments, a justice-oriented community-based organization, and local public middle school faculty. Participating in Ascend has been found to deepen urban teachers' awareness of and attention to local injustices within their curriculum and led to an increase in critical pedagogy, experiential learning opportunities outside of schools, and the urgency to center community and educator development was also found. A cousin to Ascend, the Baker Hope Clark Institute, has also demonstrated a deepening of participating teachers' critical consciousness by centering the work of historic and civil and educational rights to experience and dissect their pedagogical approaches to movement building. Both of these grassroots coalitions demonstrate a stark alternative to neoliberal education reform initiatives that are now ubiquitous within our city.